I woke up to the sound of trickling water, which would have been peaceful if it hadn't been accompanied by the metallic groaning of a giant industrial tank parked smack in the middle of my backyard. Not beside it, not near it, not in some awkward corner that I might reluctantly ignore. Dead center. Where my tomatoes had been thriving just yesterday. It looked like some water-obsessed alien mothership had descended overnight and planted a steel tumor on my private land. For a full 10 seconds I just stared, coffee mug frozen halfway to my mouth, thinking maybe I was hallucinating. But no, it was real. Very real. And there was a logo stenciled on its side in bold block letters. Property of Meadow Springs, HOA. I choked on my coffee so hard I nearly filed a second complaint to the HOA just out of principle. That was the exact moment I knew two things. 1. My life was about to get very complicated, and 2. Someone in that HOA was going to wish they'd picked literally any other property for their water storage dreams. I should probably rewind a little and explain how we got here. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac on the edge of a semi-rural town, a neighborhood that fancies itself upscale thanks to its infamous HOA. Now, before you think I'm some anti-community anarchist, let me clarify. I actually liked the idea of living in a place with a few rules. I figured it would keep things neat, avoid drama, and maybe prevent people from parking 15 lawn gnomes in their front yards. What I didn't expect was that our HOA would be run by a woman with the diplomacy of a fire hose and the charm of a wasp in your cereal. Her name? Karen Monroe. And yes, she lived up to every syllable. Karen took HOA leadership way too seriously. She once fined my neighbor $200 because his holiday wreath had a snowman wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Said it wasn't seasonally coherent. That same neighbor moved within 6 months. I had managed to stay under the radar for the most part. I kept my yard tidy, my trash bins hidden, and my mailbox painted to regulation beige. But apparently, being a model resident wasn't enough to keep the HOA tentacles from slithering into my garden. After the shock wore off, I threw on shoes and marched out to inspect the monstrosity. The tank was easily 15 feet tall, with tubes and valves sticking out like mutant spaghetti. It hummed ominously and dripped from one seam like it was already falling apart. I didn't see anyone around, but there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, which meant it had been installed sometime during the night. They literally snuck a water tank onto my land under the cover of darkness like it was some bootleg operation. Who does that? My first call was to the HOA office. Surprise, surprise, it went straight to voicemail. My second call was to my neighbor, a retired firefighter named Dave who had a knack for noticing everything. Sure enough, Dave picked up after one ring. Oh, that thing? Yeah, saw them rolling it in around 2 a.m. Thought it was weird, but figured it was some emergency setup. Emergency? On my lawn? Karen came by yesterday, yelling about some broken pipe at the clubhouse. Said they needed a temporary solution until they could fix it. On my lawn, Dave. Yeah, that part didn't make much sense. Thought maybe you approved it or something. I most certainly did not. My next stop was city zoning, where a very bored clerk named Teresa confirmed that no permits had been filed for any tank installation in our neighborhood. No paperwork. No inspection. Nothing. It was illegal in about 3 different ways, and that gave me the tiniest flicker of hope. Surely, this meant the HOA would be forced to remove it immediately, right? Wrong. When I finally cornered Karen the next day outside her house, where she was clipping her hedges like they'd insulted her mother, she didn't even flinch. Oh yes, the tank, she said, like it was a garden gnome I had misplaced. We needed somewhere to store water temporarily. HOA emergency. Nothing personal. You put it on my private property. That's extremely personal. The records are a little fuzzy about where your lot ends and the community zone begins. It's a gray area. It's not gray. I've had it surveyed. I have documentation, Karen. Then submit it to the board. We'll review it in the next meeting. Which is when? Next month. You expect me to live with this monstrosity for 4 weeks? It's a community issue. We all need to make sacrifices. I nearly laughed. Karen, who once tried to fine another neighbor for leaving a recycling bin visible for 12 hours, was now invoking the spirit of community over a rusty water tank on land she didn't own. It would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so enraging. That night, I stood by my kitchen window, staring out at the metal beast glowing dimly under the porch light. Every hiss of pressure release sounded like it was mocking me. I imagined all the tomatoes I had lovingly grown in that exact spot. Gone. Flattened by HOA tyranny. I wasn't even a gardener, not really, but it was the principle. You don't just show up and colonize someone's yard like it's the age of exploration. This was trespassing. Property violation. Pure audacity. The next morning, the situation got even worse. The tank had begun leaking more aggressively, and the water pooling around it had started to turn the ground to sludge. A section of my fence had begun to lean where the soil eroded. Flies swarmed the stagnant puddle. And to top it all off, I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox from the HOA. Not an apology. Not a permit copy. No. It was a notice stating that I was prohibited from tampering with the water tank and that any interference would be considered an act of vandalism under HOA Bylaw 6.3c. They were protecting their illegal tank with rules from a document they had just finished violating. That's when it hit me. This wasn't incompetence. It was control. Karen wanted to set a precedent. She wanted to show that even land ownership didn't matter if the HOA said otherwise. And unfortunately for her, she picked the wrong lawn to plant that flag on. I spent the rest of the day assembling documents, survey maps, lot lines, deeds, historical plats. I even called the original developer of the neighborhood, who confirmed that the land had never been intended as communal. Every square inch was mine, down to the last blade of grass the tank had crushed. By the time I was done, I had a folder so thick it could double as a stepping stool. And I had a new plan forming in my head, one that didn't just remove the tank but turned the whole situation into a spectacle Karen would never recover from. Let her enjoy her little victory for now, because by the time I was done, her water tank would be a memory. And in its place, something she'd never be able to ignore. I didn't want a fight, but now that I had one, I was going to win it with style. I wasn't just going to remove that tank. I was going to turn it into a monument, a warning sign, a gleaming reminder to every HOA board member who forgot that property lines actually mean something. And it was going to involve something wet, something permanent, and something with fins. The next few days unfolded like a slow-motion prank show, except the punchline was my yard turning into a swamp and the villain was a power-hungry HOA president who had somehow mistaken my property for her personal sandbox. The tank hissed day and night, leaking like a colander and attracting every mosquito this side of the Mississippi. The once proud lawn where I used to enjoy my morning coffee had become a slushy, algae-tinted mess, and the only ones enjoying it were the frogs that had moved in and seemed to be multiplying by the hour. I even saw a raccoon wading through the puddle like he was scouting it for his summer cabin. Meanwhile, the HOA was quieter than a squirrel at a funeral. No calls, no emails, no acknowledgement of the situation. Just that ridiculous tank looming like an oversized soup can, humming its mechanical lullaby. I decided to document everything. I took photos, videos, measured water runoff, and even recorded the noise the tank made at night. It had developed this high-pitched wheeze, somewhere between a dying kettle and a banshee, and it kept me up until sunrise. I made a time-lapse of how the muddy perimeter was expanding every hour. My neighbor Dave helped by flying his drone over the property to capture aerial shot. We dubbed the project Tankageddon. If Karen thought she could ignore me into submission, she clearly hadn't met someone as stubborn as me. I was raised by a single mom who once fought a home insurance company for 6 months over a broken window and won. Petty resilience ran in my veins. I called the city again, this time pushing harder. I was told by a tired-sounding woman named Brenda that unless the tank was causing structural damage or violating a specific zoning code, it fell under civil property dispute, which meant I had to either take the HOA to court or resolve it with them directly. I asked if installing a giant leaking tank without a permit counted as a violation. She hesitated, then transferred me to someone who promptly put me on hold for 35 minutes. By the time I hung up, I was more determined than ever to make this a spectacle. To be thorough, I reached out to a property attorney, a guy named Mark who had the bored face of someone who had seen every flavor of HOA disaster known to man. After reviewing my lot documents and the HOA's bylaws, he raised an eyebrow and asked if I had any interest in escalation. I told him escalation was now my love language. He nodded and said I had a solid case for trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized utility placement. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled the way a lion probably does right before pouncing. He asked if I wanted to handle this quietly or if I wanted to have a little fun. I asked him if he could get me a permit for a fish pond. He chuckled. "Son, I can get you a permit for a moat if you want." Karen, meanwhile, seemed to think she'd won. She strutted around the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom. I saw her gloating to one of the other board members in front of her hydrangeas. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught the words temporary setback and little tantrum. The next day, I got another letter from the HOA, this one stating that any legal threats or challenges against the HOA would be considered harassment under the community conduct policy. Harassment for wanting to remove a 2,000-gallon metal tick from my land. It was honestly impressive how fast they went from dismissive to defensive. Things escalated when a new sign appeared on my property. A wooden stake with a laminated notice nailed to it, warning that the area was now designated as a temporary communal utility zone and that trespassing would result in fines or potential legal action. I took one look at it, grabbed a screwdriver, and pried it out of the ground. Then I carried it straight to Dave's place, where we used it as kindling for a bonfire and roasted marshmallows over it. It was petty. It was perfect. I went to the next HOA meeting, not because I thought they would be reasonable, but because I wanted to watch Karen's face when I pulled out the big guns. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that looked like someone had turned a funeral home into a pottery studio. It smelled like lemon disinfectant and passive aggression. Karen stood at the front in her usual red blouse, armed with a clipboard and that smile she used when she was pretending to be polite. I waited patiently as she droned through the agenda: dog waste complaints, a debate over mailbox paint colors, someone upset about a hammock being visible from the road. Then came the open forum. I stood up and calmly handed copies of my property deed, satellite imagery, and permit documentation to each board member. I explained, in the politest voice I could muster, that the water tank was installed without my permission, on land that was indisputably mine, without permits, inspections, or basic human decency. Karen started to interrupt, but I held up a finger and kept going. I mentioned the surveyor's verification, the erosion damage, and the potential health hazard. Then I ended by announcing that I had officially filed a request with the county to excavate a decorative fish pond on that same plot of land. The board murmured. Karen blinked. "You're joking," she said, eyes narrowing. I smiled. "Nope. Got the permits. Construction starts next week." "You can't do that." "The tank is still active. And unpermitted. Which means it has to be removed before my crew shows up. County's already been notified." They weren't happy. The silence that followed was one of the greatest moments of my life. Even the treasurer, a quiet woman named Linda, who rarely spoke, muttered, "Well, he's got a point." Karen tried to rally, saying the HOA had acted in good faith, but even the other board members were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. She was losing control, and she knew it. That night, I celebrated by sketching out the fish pond's design. I wasn't going to make it small. Oh no. If I was doing this, I was going all in. A full koi pond with a waterfall feature, solar lights, and a stone walkway. Maybe even a bench with an engraved plaque. Something poetic like "Here lies HOA arrogance." I considered adding a couple of decorative gators, just for flair, but decided I didn't want animal control involved again. Over the next few days, the HOA scrambled. I started receiving emails asking if I would delay construction to give them time to move the tank. I told them I had already booked the excavation crew and any delay would cost me. The following day, the tank began hissing louder, like it was offended too. A pipe burst on the side, soaking the grass and flooding part of my patio. That's when I got my final confirmation. An official email from the city confirming that the HOA's structure had violated multiple codes and had to be removed immediately. I watched through my window as a couple of workers arrived with a flatbed and a crane. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, watching her tank get dismantled. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and gave her a cheerful wave. She didn't wave back. The tank was gone by sunset, leaving behind a crater of dead grass and rust-colored mud. But to me it was a blank canvas, the beginning of something better, something permanent. Karen had tried to claim my land. Now I was going to turn it into a monument of her failure. And I wasn't even done yet. Not by a long shot. The morning the excavator arrived, I made pancakes and ate them on my porch like I was watching a 4th of July parade. The spot where the water tank had stood just days ago was now a shallow depression of churned mud and sadness, steaming faintly under the sun. Like it, too, was glad the tank was gone. The excavator operator was a guy named Lou, a man built like a bulldozer himself, and who spoke with the calm confidence of someone who'd seen too many backyard feuds escalate into minor wars. I handed him the blueprints, offered him a cup of coffee, and said, "Dig like Karen's watching." He grinned, tipped his hard hat, and got to work. The sounds of progress were glorious. The groan of machinery, the scrape of metal on dirt, the satisfying crunch of the last remnants of the HOA's intrusion being obliterated. Lou worked like an artist with a jackhammer, shaping the future fish pond with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a demolition derby. By lunchtime, the hole was enormous, wide, deep, and perfectly placed in the exact center of my yard. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. It was the same footprint the tank had occupied, only now it was a canvas for something alive, vibrant, and undeniably mine. Karen showed up around 2 in the afternoon. I had half expected her to try something, and sure enough, there she was, storming down the sidewalk in a lime green windbreaker, and a look on her face like she'd just swallowed a lemon whole. She stopped at the edge of my property and folded her arms. "What is this?" she demanded, as if she'd caught me sacrificing goats to the moon. "Construction," I replied casually. "For my fish pond." "That's not what the permit says. It says decorative aquatic feature. That is what this is. There will be water. There will be fish. It will be decorative. Aquatic. Featured." She scowled. "This is retaliation." I took a long sip of lemonade and nodded. "That's the most accurate thing you've said in weeks. You're being petty." I raised an eyebrow. "Karen, you installed a steel monstrosity in my backyard without permission, flooded my lawn, threatened me with legal action, and then tried to gaslight the neighborhood into thinking I was the unreasonable one. If this is petty, then I'm the Picasso of pettiness." She opened her mouth to retort but was interrupted by Lou revving the excavator behind me and dropping a load of dirt with a dramatic thud. The timing was perfect. She flinched like someone had fired a starter pistol near her ear, glared one last time, then turned on her heel and stalked off. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The next day was pond liner installation. I had hired a professional crew for that part because I didn't want to risk it looking like a hole someone cried into. They laid down the black rubber liner, anchored it with smooth river stones, and began filling it with water from a tanker truck I had arranged. Within hours, the depression became a shimmering basin, sparkling under the sun like a mirror designed to reflect karma. I added a few floating lily pads, some decorative grasses along the edge, and a solar-powered fountain in the center that made a soothing gurgling sound. Every time it burbled, it felt like it was laughing. Neighbors began stopping by. Most offered compliments. A few asked if it was open to the public. One kid asked if he could put his turtle in it. I told him only if the turtle could pay rent. Dave, my drone-happy neighbor, brought over lawn chairs, and we sat by the edge that evening drinking iced tea and watching the water settle. It was beautiful, peaceful, and most importantly, it was undeniable proof that I could turn HOA tyranny into backyard art. That peace lasted a full 24 hours before the next round of HOA drama arrived in a manila envelope. The letter claimed that my pond was violating Section 8.4 of the Neighborhood Landscaping Code, which prohibited any permanent water feature exceeding a certain size without board approval. I knew this clause. I had read the HOA charter 3 times like it was bedtime poetry. My pond, of course, was precisely within the permitted dimensions. I had measured it down to the inch. The only reason they were trying to enforce that clause now was because Karen was grasping for any rule she could twist into a weapon. I sent a polite response with a copy of the city permit, a diagram of the pond's dimensions, and a highlighted section of the bylaws showing my full compliance. I also included a note that said, in the most courteous language possible, that any further attempts to interfere would be considered harassment and I would be happy to involve my attorney again. That seemed to rattle them, because the next HOA meeting was unusually quiet. Karen, for once, didn't speak unless prompted. The board looked uneasy. The cracks were beginning to show. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. A few days after the pond was complete, I received an email from one of the other HOA board members. A man named Paul who rarely said anything and always looked like he regretted being elected. He asked if we could meet for coffee. Curious, I agreed. We sat down at the local diner, and he leaned across the table with a sigh. Look, he said, I'm going to be honest. Most of the board didn't even know about the tank being installed. Karen handled it herself, said it was urgent. We assumed she had cleared it with you. She did not, I replied flatly. I figured. She told us afterward that you had agreed verbally and then backed out. I laughed. She never spoke to me once. He rubbed his temples. That explains a lot. Look, I think it's time for a leadership change. She's been using the HOA for personal vendettas for a while now, but this was too far. I leaned back and studied him. Are you saying you want to replace her? We're holding a special meeting next week. Enough of us are fed up. If you wanted to run, I think you'd have the votes. Me? Run the HOA? Why not? You've got support, and clearly, you know how to handle her. I nearly spit out my coffee. The idea of becoming the president of the HOA after everything they'd put me through felt like getting promoted by the people who just tried to set your house on fire. But as I drove home, the idea began to grow. If I was in charge, I could make sure nonsense like this never happened again. I could clean out the ridiculous rules, defang Karen's cronies, and maybe, just maybe, bring back some sanity to the community. Karen must have sensed the shift because she began knocking on doors again, trying to rally support. She spread rumors that I was going to install a nightclub in my yard, turn the pond into a boat rental business, or worse, paint my house a color not approved by the HOA. Most people smiled politely and shut their doors. Her influence was crumbling, and she knew it. Meanwhile, my pond flourished. I added koi, fat, colorful, and full of attitude. I named one of them Richard, after a board member who had always sided with Karen but now avoided eye contact at the mailbox. I installed a small bridge over the narrow end and planted some wildflowers nearby. It became a sanctuary not just for me but for the entire neighborhood. Kids loved it. Retirees stopped by to sit and read. Someone even painted a watercolor of it and gave it to me as a thank you gift. What began as revenge had evolved into something real, something beautiful. The HOA had tried to stomp on my rights, and instead, they'd handed me the very thing that would lead to their. The HOA clubhouse had never seen such a crowd. People who hadn't attended a single meeting in years showed up that night like it was a presidential election, clutching reusable coffee cups and whispering among themselves. The air was thick with anticipation and just the faintest whiff of cheap cologne. Karen stood near the front, her usual red blouse freshly ironed, her expression tight enough to snap a pencil. She knew what was coming. Everyone did. But still, she wore the look of someone who believed she could bluff her way out of an avalanche using nothing but a memo pad and misplaced confidence. When I entered, heads turned. I wasn't dressed like a candidate. No tie, no prepared speech, no smile frozen in campaign mode friendliness. I just walked in like I belonged there, because after everything, I finally did. Paul from the board gave me a nod, and a few others waved or muttered quiet encouragement. Even Linda, the quiet treasurer who usually avoided eye contact like it was contagious, smiled at me. Karen noticed. Her jaw clenched. The meeting started with the usual nonsense. Approval of previous minutes. Lawn height reminders. Someone complaining about a neighbor's wind chimes sounding like haunted bells. Then Paul cleared his throat and stood up, adjusting his glasses with deliberate calm. We've called a special session tonight due to concerns raised by multiple homeowners regarding recent decisions made without board approval, including the unauthorized installation of utility equipment on private property. Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. That matter was resolved and removed. We shouldn't revisit issues that are no longer relevant. Paul ignored her and continued. Additionally, several residents have requested a vote of no confidence in the current president. As per the bylaws, if 1/3 of the membership supports this, we are required to hold an emergency vote. He looked around the room. If anyone here would like to propose an alternative candidate, now is the time. Silence stretched for a beat. Then someone from the back, an older woman I barely knew but who once asked me for help assembling a shed, stood up and said my name. Just that. One word, but clear and steady. A few others chimed in, and before I knew it, half the room had turned toward me, murmuring agreement. Karen looked like someone had just unplugged her toaster mid-toast. She sputtered, pointing a finger. This is absurd. He has no experience. He's a troublemaker. He defied the rules, destroyed HOA property, and turned his yard into a circus. I raised my hand calmly. Actually, Karen, the water tank was unpermitted, built on private property, and a violation of municipal code. My pond, on the other hand, has full documentation and approval. I followed every rule. You're the one who didn't. She stepped forward. You have no idea what it takes to run this association. Then maybe it's time someone else finds out. The vote was held by anonymous ballot. Karen glared at each person like she could see through the paper. 10 minutes later, the count was read aloud. I had won by a landslide. It wasn't even close. The room clapped. Not wild applause, but the kind of approving, relieved clapping people do when a power outage ends or someone finally fixes a leaky faucet that's been ignored for weeks. Karen sat down, stunned, her arms folded so tightly it looked painful. She didn't speak again that night. She just sat there, watching her control dissolve grain by grain. Becoming HOA president wasn't exactly a dream come true, but I took the role seriously. I spent the next few days digging through old records, reviewing budgets, and untangling years of misplaced priorities and half-baked fines. What I found was worse than I expected. Karen hadn't just overstepped with the tank. She'd rerouted funds under vague labels like beautification and structural improvements. Several receipts were from her cousin's landscaping business, which conveniently charged double the going rate. One invoice even included a rose garden that was never planted and a gazebo that mysteriously didn't exist. I compiled it all into a neat little report and called for a board audit. At the next meeting, I presented the findings. Karen tried to object, but by then, she had no allies left. Her grip on the HOA had crumbled completely. The board voted unanimously to censure her. Then they hit her with a hefty fine for misuse of community funds. Her face turned beet red as the numbers were read out loud. "This is a personal attack," she shouted. "No," I said calmly. "This is accountability. Something you've never had to face before." That was the last straw for her. Within a week, a for sale sign popped up in her yard. Word spread quickly that she was planning to move to a different development, one with no HOA. The irony nearly gave me whiplash. With Karen gone, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted almost overnight. People who had once kept their heads down started speaking up. The meetings became more constructive, less combative. The board actually listened. We rewrote several of the more ridiculous bylaws, removing nonsense like mailbox paint restrictions and outlawing seasonal inflatables taller than 4 feet. Dave got to put up his 12-foot Halloween ghost. The community didn't collapse. In fact, it flourished. Meanwhile, my fish pond became something of a local landmark. The koi grew fat and colorful, gliding through the water like royalty. Kids named them, adults fed them, and occasionally someone would stop by just to sit on the bench and decompress. I installed a little plaque near the edge. It didn't say much. Just a small reminder. Former site of unauthorized HOA structure. Restored to peace. One evening, about 2 months after the power shift, I hosted a small neighborhood gathering. Nothing big. Just pizza, folding chairs, and people chatting by the pond under string light. It wasn't meant to be symbolic, but it felt like a celebration. The end of something heavy. The beginning of something lighter. Karen didn't show, of course. She was busy packing boxes, her once pristine lawn starting to grow weeds around the edges. I passed her house a few days later and saw her standing on the porch, looking out over the street like she didn't recognize it anymore. She saw me, gave a stiff nod, and turned back inside. I didn't wave. We were past that. Paul came by with his wife, carrying a tray of brownies and a bottle of wine. He clapped me on the back and said, "Never thought I'd say this, but you make a damn good president." I told him it wasn't exactly what I had planned. He laughed and said, "Sometimes you get handed a mess and end up building something better. Just like your pond." That night, I stood at the edge of the water, watching the koi circle lazily beneath the reflection of string lights. What started as retaliation had become something real. The pond wasn't just water and fish anymore. It was proof that you could fight back and still create something beautiful. That you could stand your ground without sinking to their level. That sometimes revenge could bloom into redemption. And as the fountain gurgled and the lights flickered, I knew that I hadn't just removed a tank. I had removed a tyrant. I hadn't just claimed my land. I had reclaimed my peace. It had been exactly 1 year since the tank debacle turned my backyard into a battleground and accidentally launched my career as the most reluctant HOA president in suburban history. Life in the neighborhood had settled into something remarkably pleasant. The air felt lighter. The rules were clearer. The board meetings were no longer dramatic productions starring passive-aggressive sighs and veiled threats. People actually showed up, gave input, and left feeling like their voices mattered. No one got fined for whimsical lawn ornaments or having their recycling bin out a few hours early. For the first time in a long while, it actually felt like a neighborhood again, not a tightly monitored amusement park run by a tyrant in orthopedic sandals. The pond had taken on a life of its own. What began as a petty response to a ridiculous act of entitlement had become the heart of the street. Families brought their kids to feed the koi, teenagers took graduation photos near the water lilies, and someone even proposed to their girlfriend on the little wooden bridge I had installed. Local birds began nesting in the wild grasses nearby. Dragonflies skimmed the surface at dusk. It was peaceful, beautiful, and most importantly, it was mine. And yet, the final chapter in the Karen saga had not yet written itself completely. The for sale sign on her lawn had eventually been replaced by a sold sign, and after several weeks of radio silence, she vanished. No goodbye, no final message, no scorched earth letter to the board. Just gone. Her house sat empty for a few months until a young couple moved in with a toddler and a golden retriever that had a tail strong enough to knock over a grown man. They brought lemonade to the next HOA meeting and asked how to volunteer. It was, in every way, the cleanest break we could have hoped for. But fate, as it often does, wasn't quite done with the punchlines. It happened one breezy afternoon, when I was trimming the hedges near the pond and Dave strolled over holding a newspaper and trying to suppress a laugh. He handed it to me, already chuckling before I unfolded it. There, printed in black and white in the local real estate news column, was an announcement that Karen Monroe had joined a new neighborhood association 2 towns over. Not only that, she had already been elected to the board and was reportedly introducing reforms to improve what she called structural discipline. Apparently, she had not learned a single thing. The article quoted her saying that her last neighborhood lacked the backbone to enforce order and that she hoped to restore dignity to community management. I read it twice just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Then I laughed harder than I had in months. It was the kind of laughter that bubbles up from the soul and makes your ribs ache. Dave sat on the bench, wiping tears from his eyes. "We're probably on some HOA villain origin story bingo card," he said. I imagined Karen sitting at another long table, pointing at someone else's lawn gnome and calling it a breach of decorum. The woman was nothing if not consistent. Despite the absurdity of it all, I found myself feeling a strange sort of pity. Karen had spent so long chasing control that she never realized how hollow it was. She didn't build communities. She broke them apart, then blamed everyone else for the pieces. And now she was doing it all over again in some other zip code, like a traveling chaos merchant with a clipboard and a grudge. Back in our own corner of the world, things just kept getting better. The board voted to install benches along the walking trail near the woods. We created a community garden, and someone started a neighborhood book exchange in a converted mailbox. We threw a block party with live music and grilled corn on the cob. People brought folding chairs and lawn games. Kids ran around in packs. I overheard one of them point at the pond and say, "That's where the giant tank monster used to live, before the fish defeated it." I didn't correct him. When the 1-year anniversary of the tank's removal approached, someone suggested we do something to mark the occasion. I agreed, mostly because I had already been planning it. A few calls later, permits were secured, food was ordered, and the Pondiversary barbecue was officially on the books. It was part celebration, part inside joke, and a full-circle moment I didn't want to miss. The event was a hit. Tables covered in checkered cloths, the smell of barbecue in the air, homemade lemonade, and more laughter than I'd heard in a long time. The pond sparkled under hanging string lights. Music played from a portable speaker, and kids took turns guessing how many fish lived in the water now. Someone even brought a cake shaped like a water tank, complete with edible rust and a sugar clipboard stuck on top. It was weird, petty, and absolutely perfect. Before the night ended, I gathered everyone for a quick toast. I stood near the bridge, drink in hand, and looked at the people who had become more than just neighbors. They were friends, allies, survivors of bureaucratic absurdity. 1 year ago, I said, I woke up to find a massive illegal tank in my yard and an HOA president who thought she could bulldoze her way through property lines and logic. What she didn't expect was a community that had just been waiting for someone to push back. She gave us a reason to stand up. And thanks to that ridiculous moment we built something better. This pond, this space, this neighborhood, it exists because we chose to care, to listen, and to fix what was broken. So here's to fish, to freedom, and to never letting someone named Karen run anything ever again. The laughter that followed echoed across the water. It felt like closure. Not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt steamrolled by pointless rules and inflated egos. We had taken something ugly and turned it into something that made people smile. That kind of victory doesn't need a headline. It just needs a community willing to grow together. As the evening wound down, people lingered, reluctant to leave. The stars came out, reflected on the pond's surface like they were watching too. The koi swam in lazy loops, unaware of the role they had played in a neighborhood revolution. I watched them for a while, then sat on the bench and took it all in. A few minutes later, a kid approached holding a small plastic bag filled with water. Inside was a single goldfish. He looked at me nervously. "Can I add him?" he asked. I named him Karen. I paused, then laughed. "Of course you did." I nodded. "Let's make her part of something beautiful." He tipped the bag carefully, and the fish swam free into its new home. It darted forward, then circled back and settled near the reeds, already blending in with its new surroundings. It didn't matter that it shared a name with the tyrant who started this all. Here, in this pond, Karen was just another fish. Small, harmless, and exactly where she belonged. And just like that, the story was complete. Not with an explosion or a courtroom showdown, but with a fish, a laugh, and the quiet ripple of water that said everything was finally, truly peaceful.